All right, the regular season is over. Week 14, rivalry week in the books. We talked about it a ton yesterday, an amazing weekend of college football. And now we're headed on to the conference championship games coming up this weekend. And we've got games on Friday and games on Saturday. And, of course, the following day, so next Sunday, is the final playoff rankings, which, of course, will give us the actual playoff bracket. Now, the playoff committee's updating the rankings again this week, I guess tomorrow night, Tuesday night, like they have been doing every Tuesday. There are some things worth paying attention to, I think, in tomorrow night's playoff reveal, like, who's higher between Miami and Bama might be something to keep an eye on. Tennessee and Indiana, who's higher there. And I'll go into maybe why I think that is here in a few minutes. But what I'm going to do today, like I've done each of the last few weeks, is in my mind, I'm going to fast forward to next Sunday. So post-conference championship games. And I'm going to give you what I think the final playoff rankings are going to be, which will show us the final playoff bracket. So this is not what I think the rankings will be tomorrow when the rankings come out. This is a projection for what the final rankings will be on the Sunday after conference championship weekend, which is this coming weekend. Now, here's the games that we have coming up, and a lot of these, of course, are very important and are going to go a long ways towards determining what that final playoff ranking and bracket looks like. You've got Tulane and Army, UNLV and Boise State. Now, this is where your group of five, highest ranked group of five champion is going to come from. It looks like it's going to be the winner of UNLV and Boise State. Now, Tulane is ranked 17, UNLV is ranked 22, but Tulane actually just lost this past weekend. So where it says 17 for Tulane right there, that's last week's playoff ranking. They're going to drop, probably unranked. They lost to Memphis this past weekend. So they're probably going to drop completely out of the rankings. They're at least going to drop behind UNLV, who, as you can see, was at 22. UNLV won last weekend, so did Boise State. So the winner of the UNLV-Boise State game is going to be the Mountain West Conference champion, and they're going to be the highest-ranked Group of Five conference champion. Now, these two teams have played already once this year in UNLV, and Boise State won by a touchdown. So it could be a really good game. We'll see. That game comes on Friday night at 8 o'clock. I'm going to live stream that game. So if you want to watch it Friday night, come on over to the channel and hang out, and we'll watch the Mountain West Conference Championship game. Again, I think the winner is going to be the highest-ranked Group of Five champion. And I'm going to show you my playoff bracket in a minute. And then you move on to Saturday, and just every game here is massive, obviously, for playoff reasons, with the exception maybe of the Marshall and Louisiana game. But you start with the Big 12 Conference Championship game, noon on ABC, Iowa State and Arizona State. Iowa State at 18, Arizona State at 16. The winner of this game is going to make the playoffs as one of the highest ranked conference champions. I believe the loser is going to be out. I think the Big 12 is only going to get one team in. My pick to win this game, as you'll see in a second, is Arizona State. They're really hot right now. They're one of the hottest teams in the country. They're sort of like West Coast South Carolina, you know. Unfortunately for South Carolina, they've got the 3 losses, didn't make the SEC title game, and are likely not going to make the final 12 for the playoffs. But they're similar in that both teams are playing really, really well right now. I think this will be a good game. Arizona State's favored by 2.5. I'm going to take Arizona State to win that one. You've got the SEC championship game coming up 4 o'clock Saturday on ABC, Georgia versus Texas. This is a rematch from the regular season. Georgia beat Texas on the road in Austin earlier this season. Was it 31-15 or something like that? Beat them by about 2 touchdowns. Texas actually favored, though, in the rematch at minus 2.5, so they're a 2.5-point favorite. Texas is playing pretty good football. Georgia has struggled some over the last half of the season. There's the bad loss at Ole Miss a few weeks ago. They gave up a ton of yards to UMass a couple of weeks ago, even though, you know, the final score was a blowout. They didn't play very well defensively. And then in their game this past weekend against Georgia Tech, it, of course, went to 8 overtimes. Georgia Tech's a 7-5 team. So I think the line here has less to do with the previous game and more to do with how these two teams are playing right now. I'm going to go with Georgia to win that one. But I do think both of these teams are making the playoffs, win or lose. The winner, I think, will get a top 4 seed and a bye. The loser is either going to host a first-round game or have to play on the road in a first-round game. And again, we're going to get to the playoff bracket in a second. Penn State on the road at Oregon for the Big Ten championship game. This is kind of a surprise. Everybody was kind of expecting Ohio State to be here. Of course, they lost to Michigan this past weekend, so Penn State slides in with just one loss. They hold a tiebreaker over Indiana. So they're going to take on Oregon. Oregon's the only undefeated Power 4 team in the country, and they're favored by 3.5. I think this could be a low-scoring, good defensive game. Penn State plays good defense, and if Drew Aller has a good game against the Oregon defense, it is possible Penn State could win the game. However, it's hard to trust James Franklin in a game of this magnitude, given how we've seen Penn State perform in some bigger games over the last 5 or 6 years. So I'm going to go with Oregon to win that game, but I do think both of these teams are going to get in the playoffs no matter who wins or loses. And then Clemson at SMU, and this might be the most interesting one here. SMU is favored by 2.5, and I do think SMU will win the game. If SMU wins, they, of course, will be in the playoffs, probably a top 4 seed, but definitely in the playoffs, and Clemson will definitely be out. It would be their 4th loss. The interesting part is going to come if Clemson wins this game. If Clemson beats SMU, then, of course, Clemson is automatically in as the ACC champion. But what happens to SMU relative to teams like Alabama, Miami, South Carolina, Ole Miss, those sort of teams that are right on the bubble, right on the outside looking in? Does the ACC end up getting 2 teams in if Clemson beats SMU, or does it knock SMU out? I'm not sure I know the answer to that, honestly. I'm not sure any of us do. Now, this is a little basic looking. I put this together just really, really quick, but this is how I think the final playoff rankings are going to shake out. These rankings will be released the Sunday after Conference Championship Saturday. So you got Conference Championship weekend coming up Friday and Saturday of this week. That very next day, Sunday, the final playoff rankings will be released. And this is my best guess on how they're going to go, based on my predictions for this week's game. Now, clearly, I could be wrong on some of these predictions, and I'm going to give you a couple of alternate scenarios as we go through here. I've got Oregon beating Penn State in the Big Ten championship game. That'll make Oregon 13-0. I think it's pretty obvious if that happens, they'll be the 1 seed. I think Georgia is going to beat Texas for a second time. That would make Georgia the 2. Now, if Texas beats Georgia, then Texas will obviously be the 2 seed. Georgia will fall. How far will they fall? I'm not sure. I don't know if they'll fall to 6, 7, or 8 and get a first round bye, or if they drop to 9, 10, 11 somewhere and have to play on the road. Not real sure, but I'm convinced, win or lose, Georgia and Texas both will be in the playoffs. My pick is Georgia, so that's how I've made the bracket here, is Georgia winning, getting a 2 seed, Texas then getting a 5, 6, 7 seed, a home playoff game. I've got SMU beating Clemson. That will put them at 12-1. Their only loss would be to BYU, a close loss to BYU. And I've got them at the 3 seed. If Clemson beats SMU, then, of course, Clemson will move up into the top 4 somewhere, and SMU will drop. How far will they drop? That's what I really don't know. Will they drop completely out of the top 12, or will they stay above Miami or Bama right there at the 11th spot? I don't know the answer to that. I just don't know the answer to that. But my predictions are that SMU wins the game, and which puts them at 3rd. I've got Arizona State winning the Big 12 Conference Championship game over Iowa State. That would eliminate Iowa State and put Arizona State as the 4 seed. So those would be your 4 buys: Oregon, Georgia, SMU, and Arizona State. I've got UNLV beating Boise State, securing the 12th spot in the college football playoff. So those are the 5 guaranteed spots: Oregon, Georgia, SMU, Arizona State, and UNLV down on the bottom at 12. I've got Penn State as the 5 seed and Notre Dame as the 6 seed. You can switch those. I'm not sure how that's going to pan out between Penn State and Notre Dame. I would put Penn State ahead of Notre Dame, so that's what I did. It's possible the playoff committee would move Notre Dame ahead of Penn State and then have Penn State at 6. But in any case, I don't see any 2 teams other than Penn State or Notre Dame being 5 and 6. So I've got them at 5 and 6. They would both get a first round home game in the playoffs. In my scenario, Georgia beats Texas in the SEC championship game. And although that's Texas' second loss, both of their losses would have been to Georgia. I've got Texas dropping to 7, hosting a home playoff game with the 7 seed. 8 and 9 are really tricky for me. I think Tennessee probably gets that 8 seed. They're ranked ahead of Indiana right now in the playoff rankings, and that's before you factor in a Tennessee win over Vandy and an Indiana win over Purdue. While neither of those wins are groundbreaking, beating Vandy is clearly better than beating Purdue, who's probably the worst Power 4 team in the country, them or Florida State. Purdue went 1-11. They've already fired their head coach. So, and Indiana blew them out. This isn't a knock on Indy, but the point is, if they already have Tennessee ahead of Indiana before that happened, I don't think Indiana beating Purdue would be enough for them to move Indiana over Tennessee. So it's probably going to be Tennessee at 8, Indiana at 9. Now, the reason this in particular is a debate worth paying attention to is because, of course, the 8 team, in my scenario, Tennessee, is going to get a home game. The 9 team, in my scenario, Indiana, is going to get the road game. So you're going to have, Indiana's going to make their argument. Tennessee will make their argument, whatever, why they should be the 8 seed, because it's a big difference between being 8 and 9. You look at Penn State, Notre Dame at 5 and 6. It's not that big of a difference. You're both going to get a home game. The difference comes in terms of who you then have to play based on your seeding. But as far as whether you get a home or away game, that's a much bigger deal. I would have Tennessee at 8 and Indiana at 9. Ohio State, I've got bumped all the way back to 10 with their second loss of the season. And it was not a good loss. The loss to Oregon is a quote-unquote good loss. Oregon's a great team. Ohio State goes on the road, plays them there, loses by 1 point at the very end. A loss is a loss, but not all losses are the same, right? We got good losses, bad losses. That was an acceptable loss. The loss to Michigan, not acceptable. So I think you got to bump Ohio State back out of the home playoff game territory, which would be 5 to 8. I think you got to put them somewhere 9 to 12. I know they beat Indiana, but they now have 2 losses and Indiana only has 1. And if you've paid attention to the playoff committee, they seem to care a lot about the number in the loss column. Maybe Ohio State gets in between Tennessee and Indiana, and you've got Tennessee at 8, Ohio State at 9, Indiana at 10, but I don't see either Indiana or Ohio State being ahead of Tennessee. But again, we'll see what the committee does, but it's that 8, 9, 10 spot is interesting. And then, of course, you've got the argument over the last spot, the 11 spot. Now, there's 12 teams, but the 12th team goes to the group of 5 in this scenario, UNLV. So it really comes down to the 11 spot for that last spot. And the argument right now seems, going on online anyway, seems to be between Miami, Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss. Now, Alabama, South Carolina, and Ole Miss each have 3 losses. Miami only has 2. Both of Miami's losses are bad losses, though. Alabama also has 2 bad losses, though. Alabama's loss to Oklahoma is a bad loss. Alabama's loss to Vandy is a bad loss. They have a good win over Georgia, right? And then they have a good loss against Tennessee. That's the sort of the resume for Bama, right? They've got the 1 good win against Georgia. Miami doesn't really have any good wins, at least not in terms of beating ranked opponents. Now, I think Louisville is one of the best 25 teams in the country, but the playoff committee doesn't have Louisville ranked. Maybe they will this week. Louisville beat the hell out of Kentucky last week. Maybe Louisville gets ranked this week, which would help Miami because Miami would then have a win over a top 25 team, which right now they don't have. The argument for South Carolina and Ole Miss becomes a little bit harder to make, particularly in the case of South Carolina. They've got 3 losses. So does Alabama. So does Ole Miss. But South Carolina lost to both Alabama and Ole Miss. The only real argument I think that you can make for South Carolina is that they're playing better today than either of those other 2 teams. And I agree with that. I think South Carolina is playing better right now than either Alabama or South Carolina. They're probably playing better than Miami right now, too, who has lost to Georgia Tech and Syracuse in the last 3 weeks. 2 bad losses. The problem is there's been a lot made about going to the 12-team playoff in the fear that it may devalue the regular season. I understand that fear, and I think you have to count the entire season. And it is true. South Carolina's won, I think, 7 games in a row. They've looked really, really good. All of that is true. It's also true that they lost 3 games in the first 6 weeks of the season, and you just can't ignore that. The season is not 6 weeks long. The season didn't start in the middle of October. It started in the end of August, beginning of September, and South Carolina lost 3 games. Now, one of those games is very questionable. The LSU game in Columbia, a penalty called on a pick six that took a touchdown off the board for South Carolina, and I understand that, and that was a bad call. It was a bad call. But you had a chance to win on the road at Alabama at the end. You had multiple chances to win that game at the end. Get the onside kick, the whole deal. You lose. Kind of get blown out by Ole Miss. So I'm not crapping on South Carolina. I would pick South Carolina today to beat Alabama tomorrow. I would pick South Carolina today to beat Ole Miss tomorrow. But they don't play tomorrow. They played 2 months ago. So I feel like South Carolina's probably the odd one out in the whole Miami, Alabama, Ole Miss, South Carolina thing. I feel like it's probably going to come down to a debate between Miami and Bama. As far as who wins that debate in the committee room, I don't have any idea. I've got no clue. No idea at all. Now, all of this could be avoided if Clemson beats SMU. If Clemson, who you can see is not on my playoff list here because I've got Clemson losing to SMU in the ACC championship game, if I'm wrong on that and Clemson beats SMU, then you can pencil Clemson in up here. I'm pointing the wrong way. Up here, you could pencil Clemson in up here where SMU is, and then you can just take SMU and slide them down to where it says Miami and Alabama, and that solves that argument right there. Neither Miami or Alabama get in. You put an SMU at 11, who would be 11-2, only 1 loss in the regular season, 2 total losses, 1 loss coming in a championship game, a game that neither Miami or Alabama were good enough to make it to. So do you really want to punish SMU if they lose in a conference championship game? Do you really want to punish them to the point where you're putting a 3-loss Bama or a 2-loss Miami, who was in the same conference as SMU, ahead of SMU because SMU lost a 13th game that Miami and Bama weren't good enough to make it to? I don't think they would do that. So if Clemson beats SMU, I don't think you have to worry about the Miami, Alabama, South Carolina, Ole Miss argument. I think all those teams would be out. SMU would be at 11. Clemson would be in the top 4. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think SMU is going to beat Clemson. So there is going to be an argument and a debate, and somebody's going to get left out. And we've talked about this constantly. When we had a 4-team playoff, we talked about who's 4, who's 5, right? All the time. Sometimes who's 4, who's 5, 5 and 6. Should 6 be 4? Should 5 be 4? Right? Now you got a 12-team playoff. Who should be 11? Should 13 be 11? You have to skip 12 because UNLV goes there. But, who deserves it more? Is it Miami? Is it Bama? Is it South Carolina? Is it Ole Miss? Is it some other team that I'm not thinking of? Let me know down below. But anyway, this is how I think it's going to shake out. This is how I think it's going to shake out when the final rankings come out next Sunday. Again, not the rankings that are coming out tomorrow. Forget the rankings that are coming out tomorrow. I'm talking about the actual final rankings that determine the bracket. This would make for some interesting games, by the way, if it did break down this way. You'd have UNLV on the road at Penn State. So you'd have the desert, UNLV, traveling to Happy Valley to play a football game in the middle of December. You would have either Miami or Bama, just pick one, traveling to play on the road at Notre Dame. Either way, this is amazing. Bama at Notre Dame, 2 all-time great names in college football, meeting for a home playoff game. If it's Miami, a throwback to the whole convicts versus Catholics deal from the 80s and 90s, right? Well, what an unbelievable atmosphere and game that would be. What about Ohio State on the road at Texas in the middle of December for a playoff game? You telling me these types of matchups don't excite you? I'm talking to the people who are against the 12-team playoff. Ohio State at Texas on December 21st doesn't excite you? And then you'd have either Tennessee at Indiana or Indiana at Tennessee. I don't see how you can be a college football fan and not get excited about the potential in these matchups here. You're telling me you would rather be watching what? You'd rather be watching Florida versus what? Louisville in the Alamo Bowl than to watch these games in the middle of December? Come on, man. Come on, man.
Come on, man.
Anyway, that's what I think. Let me know where I'm wrong. Have a good morning.